Welcome to the Illuminating Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Marcia Narayan Weldon, and I'm a lawyer, business strategist, corporate trainer, and executive coach. Each week, I'm going to bring you my favorite entrepreneurs, thought leaders, legal professionals, and other coaches who will inspire, educate, and empower you. Are you dealing with burnout, stress, and you just want to be happier at work? Then this episode is for you, whether you're a lawyer or not. Nora Riva Bergman is a lawyer, a law firm coach, and the creator of the 50 Lessons for Lawyers book series, including 50 Lessons for Lawyers, Earn More Stress, Less Be Awesome, 50 Lessons for Women Lawyers, From Women Lawyers, and 50 Lessons for Happy Lawyers, Boost Wellness, Build Resilience, Yes You Can. In this episode, we explore the pillars of mindfulness, balance, and recovery, and learn how to thrive in any profession. Nora is a business coach and has been certified Atticus Practice Advisor since 2006 and a licensed attorney since 1992. She's coached hundreds of lawyers across the country and brings a deep understanding of the practice and business of law to her work with lawyers, law firms, and bar associations. She's practiced as an employment law attorney and a certified mediator and has served as an adjunct professor. By the end of this episode, you'll have some practical tips you can use right now to be more productive, less stressed, and most important, happier. I'm so happy to see you today, Nora. When this airs, it's going to be Mental Health Awareness Month in May, although I don't really know why we have a month. I think it should be something we think about every day. And one of your claims to fame is you have actually found 50 lessons for happy lawyers. Who would have thunk it? And I don't want people who are saying, I'm not a lawyer, I don't need to listen to this, to tune out, because the lessons we're going to talk about today are ones that match everybody. Now, you are a law firm coach. You're a lawyer. I think we graduated the same year in 92. What made you decide to take on the Herculean task of finding ways to make lawyers happy?
Oh, well, first, Marcia, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a thrill to see you and have a chance to talk with you. The Herculean task. Well, let me step back for just a moment about that question, because one of the lessons in this book, and by the way, this 50 Lessons for Happy Lawyers is one of 3 books in the 50 Lessons for Lawyers series, started in 2016 with just general lessons, focusing on everything from time management to marketing, etc. Then we did a book entitled 50 Lessons for Women Lawyers from Women Lawyers that launched in 2019. And while I was putting that book together, I got the idea for this book. Actually, it was going to be solely focused on the concept of mindfulness. And there's a lesson in this book that speaks to mindfulness. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, that is an incredibly important topic from my perspective. But there's so much more really to what contributes to our wellness and our well-being. Mindfulness is a foundation for that, in my opinion. But there's more. And when I first floated the idea, the title of this book to some of my friends, 50 Lessons for Happy Lawyers, several people, not just one, said to me, isn't that an oxymoron? Exactly. And I said, it doesn't have to be. It truly doesn't have to be. And so these books, this one especially, I think really our goal, and by the way, I have a co-author on this book, a woman named Chelsea Castro. Chelsea is also a lawyer, but she does not practice anymore. She has a psychotherapy practice in Chicago.
And she's a licensed clinical social worker. She's got all kinds of things going on.
I know, she got a lot of letters. And she's brilliant. And we had a really wonderful time putting this book together. And as we put it together, we drew on science and research and other people's research into this topic of happiness and wellness and well-being. It was our goal to pull on these resources, make them available to not just lawyers, but anyone that wants to learn about this topic. And we cite probably 70 or 80 other books in this book with resources to send people to those books. We highly recommend every book that we cite for people to read, but we try to pull nuggets from them and create short, bite-sized, easily digestible concepts that you can actually start putting to work in your life. At the end of every lesson, there's a little section on how to actually implement the things that you just learned if you think you want to experiment with them.
And that's what I love about this book. I feel like it's a toolkit with things that you can do every day. And one of the reasons I put this podcast out is to bring experts who, when somebody finishes the podcast, they can say, I can go ahead and do that. But let's talk about what happiness
Yes.
really means. So I am a person who is happy for no reason. And there's actually a book called Happy for No Reason by Marcy Shimhoff, who co-wrote a lot of the Chicken Soup for the Soul books. And I actually got trained in her methodology. So it doesn't matter what's going on. I'm going to find a way to be happy. That's really hard for most people, right? Because you really have to retrain your brain. So what does it mean to be an actually happy lawyer? Does it mean that you're just not super stressed out? How do you define that?
Well, there is a dictionary definition for happiness, right? If you pick up the dictionary, you can go to the dictionary and find out the definition of happiness. But really, happiness is a subjective thing. So I can't answer that question. What does it mean to be a happy lawyer?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's whatever makes you feel that way, whatever makes you feel happy. And I love that phrase, happy for no reason. And I wasn't familiar with that book, so you just turned me on to a new book. Um, but what you said is absolutely spot on. It's very difficult, not just for lawyers, but for most people to cultivate that sense of happiness and positivity for a whole host of reasons, some of which we go into in the book. Our brains are wired to
Mm-hmm.
notice the negative just through years of evolution.
Mm-hmm.
That rustling in the bushes
Right.
thousands of years ago could have either been a bird or could have been a tiger that was going to kill us. So we kind of view
Mm-hmm.
so many things in our lives with that negativity bias. So our brains have to constantly struggle to be aware of that bias and to overcome that bias. And for most people, you can't just flip a switch, and be happy. That's why the very first lesson in the book is titled Happiness, Like the Law, is a Practice, and
Absolutely.
it's something that you can work on and practice every day by
Mm-hmm.
experimenting perhaps with some of the lessons in the book to
Mm-hmm.
see whether or not you can elevate your level of not just happiness, but as we talk about your level of sense of wellness, well-being, resilience, etc. One of the books that we cite in that very first lesson is a book called The How of Happiness. And I just want to touch on this for a second because it does go to that idea of, why can't we just be happy for no reason? Well, we kind of can, but we still need to do intentional things to get there. So The How of Happiness talks about research from a professor named Sonia Lyubomirsky.
Mm-hmm.
And Ms. Lyubomirsky, Dr. Lyubomirsky, is a professor at UC Berkeley. And she did a longitudinal study of twins. So I won't go into all the research, but I highly recommend her book. And the bottom line that she talks about in her book is that all of us have essentially kind of a happiness baseline. About
Absolutely.
50% of our happiness is
Mm-hmm.
based on our genetics, our
Right.
DNA. Um, Only about 10% of our happiness is based upon our circumstances, things that happen
Right.
to us. But don't we all think, or I used to think, you'll be happy when? I'll be happy when I get that
Exactly.
car. I'll be happy when I make partner. I'll be happy when I get the new house. Those circumstances only account for about 10% of what makes us happy. And I think all of us can probably attest to that because you get the new car or you get the new job and it maybe doesn't make you as happy as you thought it was going to. And over time, you acclimate to that new sense of what you thought was going to be making you happy. And you're always kind of searching for that next thing that's going to make you happy. And in Dr. Lyubomirsky's research, she found that 40% of what accounts for the level of happiness that we feel in our lives is really a result of our intentional activity, what
Yeah.
we do, the things that we do to make ourselves happy and feel happy. And that is something that we do have control over.
And that's actually, and Marcy Shimhoff, she actually cites those statistics in the book. And, you look at the things like the lottery winners who, end up 2 years later being miserable. And it's, everybody thinks if I won $20 million, yeah, I can cry with the $20 million, but at least I'm crying with $20 million. But it's still, they're not
Yeah,
happy. And at some point,
yeah.
happy people live longer, they make more money. There's so many statistics on the importance of happiness. And for me, right, you can't just, you have to do something every day. And I work on it, especially during the COVID pandemic when I was stuck in the house for 2 years, right? I worked on it like a full-time job. Every day I did something about happiness. And now it just naturally kind of kicks in, regardless of the circumstances. That doesn't mean I don't cry, doesn't mean I don't get down, doesn't mean I don't get sad or depressed, but I'm able because I've built up that muscle, like the happiness muscles. so that
Yeah.
I can bounce back much more quickly and be more resilient. But let's talk about
Yeah.
some of your lessons. I want to pick through some of my favorites, and let's
Okay.
first of all, everybody should buy the book, right? Even if you're not a lawyer, but especially if you are a lawyer, because we have such high rates of addiction, suicide, depression, and apparently, by the way, if you're a veterinarian, because apparently they have even higher rates than we do. I didn't know this until recently, but
I
please
didn't
pick
know
up.
that.
Who
Yeah.
would have thought? Because I thought about being around animals
Yeah.
because you have something that adopt a
Yeah.
dog or a cat. And interestingly, my son has a cat, and I was like, please don't get it. We didn't do that in the lease. We didn't sign it, but he's happier. He loves this cat. He pets this cat, and at the law schools they bring dogs on campus around finals times, and
Yeah.
we used to go to nursing homes when my son was a Cub Scout and take dogs and pets for the residents because there's a huge benefit, and you actually get that oxytocin, that bonding chemical, right, when you're around animals. So, but I'm not going to go through that one. I'm going to pick some other ones. Let's
Okay.
look at lesson number 3: why resilience matters. And this is so important. I was talking to someone the other day, and they said, these kids today, which every generation has said, right, have no resilience. So, first of all, let's make sure we're on the same page. What do we mean by resilience? And then why does it matter?
Okay, what do we mean by resilience? Well, again, the definition of resilience essentially is you can think of a sponge, by the way. The resilience is the ability after being put under pressure to bounce back to the original form. So when you think about squeezing a sponge and letting it go, it bounces back to its original form. So that's the dictionary definition of resilience. And as it applies to us, as humans, not just lawyers, but as humans, resilience is the ability to also bounce back after we have been put in a stressful situation or gone through a trauma or whatever might affect us in our lives. And the ability to bounce back perhaps even better than we were before. We talk about the fact that humans are more resilient, and we can be more resilient than sponges. We can actually bounce back better than we were before. The other thing I want to say just about the definition of when you think about the word resilience, which is used a lot nowadays, by the
Yeah.
way, um, you know, uh, as humans, that ability to bounce back better is something that we can cultivate. It's not like you're born resilient or you're not born resilient.
Right.
Resilience is actually a series of traits and skills that we can develop. Like all of the lessons in this book, at the end of every lesson, we give you a little section called Living the Lesson, how to actually experiment with the lesson that you've just read about in your own life and put it to work in your life. And with respect to resilience, there are certain things that we can do to cultivate resilience, especially throughout the day. Now I'm talking to lawyers for a second,
Mhm.
because lawyers work in a way that's almost antithetical to taking care of themselves and developing resilience. And so there are things that we can do throughout the day that actually build that resilience, and it multiplies on itself day after day after day. And there's small little things that we can do.
Okay. Any specific recommendations? Give us like your 2 favorite things. If you're talking to somebody, say, where do I start? What are 2 things somebody can do to help build resilience? And then I want to ask you to think about for parents who have small kids, because I love to see parents who are listening to this say, I'm going to help build a more resilient child. What do you recommend? First for specific tips for the adults, and then for those who are raising children.
Okay, so first for the adults, I think one of the most, and not just me saying this from the authors that we cite in the book, one of the most effective things that we can do as humans and especially as lawyers is to create time where we can actually work in a focused manner.
Mm,
I talk with my clients about the value of uninterrupted time, and not dealing with needless interruptions throughout the day, as many lawyers do.
hmm.
Many lawyers live in a culture and a law firm where there's just constant interruptions from others, distractions in our own mind, throughout the day. So the more that we can create that uninterrupted focus time and kind of reframe what our workday looks like, the more resilient we can become, because we give our brains the opportunity to focus. And that's an important part of developing resilience. The other thing I would say as a way to develop what we refer to as micro resilience throughout the day is to take short breaks, short little breaks. Again, talking to lawyers, most lawyers will sit down at their desk and some of them will not come up for air until 5 or 6 or 7 in the afternoon. And that is just not good for your health, number one. And it's not good for your brain. I mean, your brain is not at its best when it is overworked and stressed out. So every 30 minutes, if you can, and anybody can, take a 30-second break, stand up, look out the window,
Yep.
pick up some weights. I keep weights in my office, and I do some weights, something to break your pattern so you can be refreshed and come back. And every 90 minutes or a couple of hours, literally get up and walk around, or take a couple of moments and watch something funny on YouTube or somewhere to lift your spirits. It's okay. You said earlier, Marcia, when you're happy, things just work better. They flow more smoothly. You feel better. And in addition to that, there is a ton of research that shows that when we are in a positive state of mind, our brains work more effectively. And that's something that we can cultivate. I want to come back for just a moment too, to talk about that concept of positivity. What we are not talking about in this book is toxic positivity. Okay. Right. And when I say toxic positivity, I mean ignoring those things in life that are painful, ignoring those things in life that are difficult. That's not a recipe for any kind of health. Right. Toxic positivity simply just asks you to ignore the weeds in your garden. If you got weeds in your garden and you just look at them and say, oh, they're not really there, I'm not going to pay attention to them, they're going to take over your garden. But you can look at those weeds with a positive attitude and say, I'm getting them out of my garden, pull them out and get rid of them. So that's a distinction that we make very early on in the book. We don't want anyone to think that we're talking about happiness is just, oh, I'm going to, be happy, right, and I'm going to disregard or ignore every negative or possibly negative thing in my life. So those are two things for adults. Create focus time and give yourself breaks throughout the day, strategic breaks throughout the day. With respect to kids, my child is a 10-year-old Samoyed dog who brings me a lot of happiness. But, I think in terms of what you can do for your kids is to model the kind of behavior that, that they can see and emulate as they grow up. I know when I was little, my mom and dad would not make it a big deal out of, if I fell down. I fell down. It wasn't, oh my God, what's happened to you? Right. But I don't, I would just say, do your best to model the kind of behavior by showing your kids, how to develop that resilience within themselves. And that does extend into adults too, because this book was written for individuals so that we can begin to model the kind of behaviors that we want to see in our law firm culture. And if leaders can begin to take on some of these ideas and model them for the people that work for them, that will kind of trickle down and bubble up at the same time.
Let's talk about failure then, because I think that's one of the areas where resilience really comes in. Lawyers, doctors, people in professional services firms, but just about business owners, we hate the thought of failing, whatever that might mean. And resilience is one way to deal with whatever failure means to you. And I know for me, I try to do hard things or things that are difficult now on a weekly basis, things that I don't like. Some things might be, now I don't have a problem with them anymore. Even things like taking cold showers or deliberate cold exposure or things like that shock the system. First of all, they have tremendous health benefits, but also it really helps build resilience. So I'm like, okay, I was in cold water for 6 minutes. I'm sure I can deal with this issue, right? Even though it's little, you're building up, you're telling your body you can do it. And with lawyers and law students who might be listening in or others, thought of failure, like failure is not an option. But when you have that resilience, you're able to come back from whatever your perception of failure is. So can you talk a little bit about that, especially because I know you coach law firms. Do you deal with them in the thought of failure? And if so, what are your recommendations?
Okay, great question. So what you just said made me think of several different lessons in this book, not just the lesson on failure, But there's a lesson called don't be so judgy. And
Mm-hmm.
we're lawyers, so we
Right.
judge. As humans, we judge things all the time. So
Absolutely.
in terms of how to deal with air quotes failure,
Mm-hmm.
one of the most powerful things we can do is to reframe that. Was that really a failure? Or was it an opportunity for something else? I've interviewed a number of people for this book, and one of the lawyers that I interviewed is a man named Greg Stokes. He's just a brilliant, brilliant lawyer, wonderful guy,
Mm-hmm.
super inspirational on social media, always posting really fabulous quotes and things. And he talked about failure and said, some of his greatest learnings as a lawyer and his greatest catapults to leaping forward what he considered failures at the time. And I think you talk to a lot of very successful people and they will tell you the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So reframing what failure feels like for you can be a very, very powerful thing. And coming back to the other lesson that I mentioned, don't be so judgy.
Mm-hmm.
A few years ago, I had the opportunity to hear a man named Sri Kumar Rao speak,
I love
and
him.
he's written,
Love him. Yes.
yeah, isn't he fabulous?
He's
He
amazing.
wrote a
Yeah.
book called Happiness at Work, right?
Right.
And he talked about what he calls being really judgy. And he says, you know, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Who knows? But resist the urge to label something that happens to you as a
Right.
bad thing or a failure. Um, and I've thought this before I even heard him speak, but let's say, for example, you get up in the morning, you got to your car to go to work, and you have a flat tire, and you have a meeting that's really important that you're going to be missing now because of the flat tire. Most of us would label that flat tire as a really bad thing. It's a bad thing that happened. And according to Dr. Rao, once you label something as bad, that is
Mm-hmm.
the beginning of our suffering because we ruminate on it. And it was a bad thing that happened to me. And we'll go back and we'll replay it in our mind. But in reality, do you really know whether that was a bad thing? That flat tire could have prevented you from getting in an accident an
Mm-hmm.
hour later. Those things you'll never know, right? But I would venture for everybody listening to us or watching us today, you can think about a time in your own life when you labeled something as bad. Oh my God, that was a really bad thing. In retrospect, a week, a month, a year, years later, you look back on that event and say, oh, I'm grateful for that thing. That was really a good thing. So, to the extent that we can not label things as failures or not label things as bad, perhaps try to reframe them and see what could possibly be a positive outcome from here. And if that's not possible, then just it's a thing. I had a flat tire. It's not the end of the world. Um,
Well, it's funny you say you'll never know because I cannot tell you the amount of times on more than two hands when I have been delayed. I forgot my cell phone or my keys. I went back upstairs and then I'm driving and I see an accident that had just happened. Like I see that the cops are just getting there, or I can, you see the smoke coming from the car repeatedly. And I've started to think of those things, of those delays or something that's a failure. Maybe I didn't get a project done, or maybe I didn't get something that I expected as a divine detour. Because now I think about it is that there's a reason for this.
yeah,
I'm like, all right, thanks. And I just say, thanks for that. And I just keep going. And it makes me much more positive because maybe I wasn't going to avoid an accident. But like you talked about, the reframe, our mind and our words are so powerful. When we can reframe it to something like, or just detach from what it means, detaching from that outcome, it's like, it is what it is. We don't give any meaning to it. And another thing is, think about whether this is going to matter, you know, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 months, 5 years from now. And a lot of times we think this is the end of the world, but 5 months from now, you don't even remember it happened, right? If it is
yep,
something that's going to
absolutely.
matter 5 months or 5 years from now, then yeah, you should really think about it. But if it's really not going to matter, just move past. And that's another way to, again, and lawyers, we're so serious, right? And sometimes, everything is a catastrophe. Everything is not a catastrophe, right? Everything is not an emergency. And we just have to kind of figure out
Yep,
how to deal with that. I want to go to your
yep.
lesson number 4, beat burnout, right? So burnout is now a World Health Organization has recognized it, but it's not something you can get workers' comp for. So nobody get excited like, I'm burnt out, I'm going to take a leave of absence. But when should lawyers take a leave? And what's the difference between stress and burnout? And in lesson 4, you talk about beating burnout. And here's what you actually say. You quote the Dalai Lama. If you feel burnout setting in, if you feel demoralized or exhausted, it is best for the sake of everyone to withdraw and restore yourself. Fine, because he's in Tibet. What about the lawyers who say, I can't withdraw, I've got so much to do? And what happens when we work in a state of chronic burnout?
Well, we can't work in a state of chronic burnout, at least not effectively. I guess that's how I would answer that question. And kind of what you're getting at a little bit from my perspective, Marcia, is the culture of the law firm, the culture of the law, not just the law firm. You know, the legal culture is one where people brag about working long hours. This has gone on for centuries. You know, I'm in the office first, I'm the last to leave. I come in on the weekends to work. And there are a lot of firms out there who talk about the value of health and wellness and well-being with a wink and a nod, because the
Right.
partners come in on the weekend and look around to see who might be working, you know, all of those subtle messages. So you really can't work effectively when your brain is burned out or when you are feeling chronic stress. And in the book, we give a table actually of symptoms and what burnout looks like for lawyers. And so that can be really helpful, just awareness of whether or not you're burned out, because I think that a lot of lawyers especially just work, that becomes the new normal for them, feeling
Right.
burned out when it really isn't the new normal. So what are some of the things that you can do to kind of address that and move past it? The lessons in this book, as I said, some of them all cite other lessons. They kind of work together.
Yes.
And when I think of burnout and things that you can do during the day, week, month to address burnout, my brain goes directly to a lesson on the importance of recovery. You
Yes.
know, athletes need recovery to be at their best. So, and when I say athletes, if you think of the different types of sports, football, baseball, marathons, golf, whatever it might be, marathon runners don't run marathons every single day.
Right.
They need time to recover. Tennis players don't play in tournaments every week or every month. They need time to recover. And they have an off season where they're not possibly doing very much work on their sport so that they can recover. So, like those people, lawyers are also athletes in a very real sense. And this comes back to the burnout idea. If you're feeling burned out, then there's a very good likelihood that you're not getting the kind of recovery that you need, either throughout the day by taking the kind of mini breaks that I mentioned, or recovery days. Athletes take recovery days where they don't work out. And lawyers need those days too, whether it's a weekend day or a day during the week, whatever can work for you. Those are considered short-term recovery. And then there's long-term recovery, which would be off-season for athletes. For lawyers, it would be vacations, you know, actually
Vacation?
taking a
What do you
vacation.
mean?
Yeah,
Who
a
has time for that?
vacation. Yeah, yeah, we all do if we make the time for it, for sure. Um, and I realize I'm saying these words and speaking to some people who live in a law firm culture that does not support the kinds of things that we're talking about. I get that. And I understand that institutionally, there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done in the legal profession to change the culture. That may take quite some time. We can raise awareness about it, we can focus on it, but in the meantime, we need to be taking care of ourselves to the extent that we can. And that's where I say we have both the trickle down and the bubble up. So if the awareness of the issue of burnout is something that you know for yourself and you can express to others around you, and you can take steps to address that in your own life, and people around you can see what you are doing and how much more effective you are
Mm-hmm.
by doing the things that we suggest in the book and whatever else might work for you.
Right.
Um, I talked a lot around around burnout, right?
Mhm.
Because the most important thing is to be aware of it and what it feels like for you, to realize that having the symptoms of burnout, apathy, sluggishness, not feeling like you want to do the things that used to make you happy. There's a whole litany of them. Uh, Recognize them, be aware of them, and know that does not need to be your new normal. There are things that you can do to change that.
So, speaking of new normal, and maybe it's not new normal, we're in 2023 right now, where firms have said it's time to come back into the office. And there's a lot of resistance. You talked about the partners coming in to see who's there, but sometimes the partners aren't even in the office. What are you seeing around happiness and mental health and wellness and connectedness with this struggle that people are dealing with about whether to be in the office or not? Because we also have a tremendous loneliness epidemic. And now you have some people secretly saying, I kind of like being in the office. I kind of want to be around people, right? And people don't realize that we have a biological need to be around other people, right? We were not meant to be alone. No, I'm not saying people have to be in the office 5 days a week. And by the way, I'm sitting here looking at the ocean and I'm happy to never go back in the office. But for other people, I'm just kidding. But but it's a big struggle that law firms, businesses, the tech companies, everybody that was saying work wherever you want, you're saying it's time to come back in. Love your thoughts on that. And is it different if you're at a different stage of your development? And we're talking about how to be a happy lawyer, but also how to be a productive lawyer. Because is that mentoring happening by osmosis, or was that always a myth? So that's about 15 questions in one. But
Oh my God.
when we're talking about happiness and
That
loneliness,
last comment.
like we were talking about happiness and loneliness and need to be connected with a very tough work culture in law firms and tech companies, etc., and with economic headwinds going on right now, where we may or may not be heading into a recession. Um, there's a lot for lawyers and others to think about whether being in the office is right for them or not. For some people, they thrive because they're away from all that pressure, and some people are really lonely but don't know if going back into the office is going to be better for them.
Yeah, I think you kind of just hit the nail on the head. Some people want to be working remotely. Some people want to be in the office. I think that the law firms that will be most successful going forward are going to allow some level of flexibility there. There are some roles within a law firm, not talking lawyers now, but non-lawyer staff that might be more critical to be in the office. But I think lawyers need the flexibility to, this is just me talking now. I think lawyers need the flexibility to have that option to work remotely. I worked with a couple of firms shortly, as the pandemic was ending, and not all of them, but a couple of the firms that I worked with, they immediately wanted everybody back in the office. And a number of folks were, at that time, I think this is lessened now, just very reluctant because the pandemic was still kind of there and they really didn't want to come back. And making it a mandate, I don't think is realistic going forward. Giving your people options that are fair to everyone. I think law firms need to create policies around their ability to work remotely and
Mhm.
apply those policies fairly to everybody in the firm. But giving them that option and creating opportunities for people to come in. You mentioned the idea, does mentoring happen by osmosis or was it always a myth? There are some firms that do a great job of mentoring attorneys, and
Right.
others, I think they do expect it to be, osmosis. They, again, we'll talk about it, but not really do it. So do you need to physically be in the office with someone to get that mentoring experience? I think it definitely supports it, but I think that could also be some type of hybrid arrangement,
Mhm.
like we're talking right now. And
Absolutely.
I have worked with lawyers since 2006 as a coach after I stopped practicing. And I have been doing Zoom meetings with clients all over the country since long before the pandemic started.
Right.
And at that time, I still had people that wanted to do a phone call, but now everybody's on Zoom all the
Right.
time.
Right.
which can be fatiguing from time to time, you know.
I'm okay with the phone
But
call
but you,
by the way. It doesn't always have
yeah,
to be
yeah,
on
yeah,
Zoom.
yeah, yeah. But you get the sense that you really can see other people and interact with them. But I think that flexibility needs to be there. I just really do.
Agreed. So let's talk about lesson number 8, the one thing that can change everything. And you say the one thing that can change everything is meditation. So this is really important because I am an active meditator, but I have a lot of coaching clients who say, look, A, I don't have the time to meditate. B, I don't like to do it. C, I don't see why it's helpful to me. I'd rather go for a run instead. So, why do you think this is the one thing that can change everything? And how do you deal with people who are skeptical? Because I think some people think it's always, sitting there and, with your hands in a certain mudras and that kind of stuff. And there's so many different types of meditation, but why is this the one thing that can change everything?
You picked one of my favorite lessons in the book, and as a matter of fact, this lesson appeared in slightly different format in the very first book that I wrote back in 2016.
Hmm.
And I wrote it from a personal perspective because of how it helped me get through some tough times in my own life. Um, and we put it back in this book, edited and updated a little bit because I truly believe it is the one thing that can change everything. You know, clients come to me wanting to manage their time better, wanting to market better, you know, want to deal with developing their staff and recruiting and all these things. And the one thing that can impact all of that is mindfulness. And why? Okay. So, since we wrote this book, I learned of another book that I would highly recommend to everyone. We did not cite it in this book,
Hmm.
but it's a book called Peak Mind
Hmm.
by Amishi Jha, right?
Hmm.
Professor at the University of Miami. Absolutely brilliant. And Dr. Jha refers to mindfulness not as meditation, but
Right.
as training, mindfulness training. And I think that for so many people, and especially lawyers, the idea of mindfulness is always sitting on a lotus cushion, like you just said, with your, and it's spiritual. It's too touchy feely for those left brainers. They can't get their brain around it literally or figuratively. But when you switch the context of it from meditation to training your brain, which is really
Mhm.
what it is,
Yes.
I think that makes a world of difference. And just a couple things that I will say about it in the context of how mindfulness training can help lawyers. There are many, many health benefits to meditation. Everything from lower blood pressure to increased immunity to an overall sense of increasing your health and well being and happiness and all of those things. An ability to recognize and be aware of our own emotions and have a better ability to manage them, increasing our emotional intelligence, all of those things.
Hmm.
But from a purely lawyer perspective, what mindfulness training helps us do is to be able to give our attention to the thing that we wish to give our attention to.
Hmm.
And notice when we're not doing that and bring ourselves back to what we want to focus on. So earlier we talked about developing resilience. And I said one of the most effective things that we can do to build our resilience throughout the day is to
Hmm.
create periods of time where we're focused, where we can work in an uninterrupted form, free from email, texts, people knocking on our door, those kinds of interruptions. But the truth is, even if we give ourselves that time, we can still be interrupted by our own brain, distracted by our brains, who are like flitting off to whatever might bring our attention at any point.
Right.
If you're working on a brief and you want to stay focused on that brief, um, at least for some period of time, what meditation training helps you do is to notice when you are thinking about that thing you don't want to think about and bring your mind back to the brief or what you want to focus on until you give yourself a break. So mindfulness is really just about being aware of our thoughts, cognizant of our thoughts, letting them float by like clouds in the sky.
Mhm.
It's not about stopping thought. I guess you are I know that you meditate regularly and have for years.
Mhm.
So I'd kind of love to hear your thoughts on this. But what I tell the clients that I work with, because I recommend mindfulness training to all of them,
Mhm.
is that number one, it is not about stopping thoughts. It's
Right.
about noticing thoughts
Absolutely.
and saying, okay, and not just a thought, a feeling, an emotion, whatever it might be, noticing it. Oh, I had that, but now I'm going to come back and I'm going to focus on my breath again, or whatever my intention is. And the more your mind does that, notice and come back, notice and come back, notice and come back, it strengthens those areas of your brain that allow you to stay focused on something,
Mhm.
which is just so incredibly valuable. Um, Not just to us as human beings, but to the work that we do as lawyers.
And it's
And
also really
when I talk to lawyers about that, like that concept of mindfulness training, they're like, oh, maybe I should try that. I think I want to experiment with that a little bit.
It also helps you in terms of responding versus reacting. I started off as a litigator and, lots of, immediately, wanted to send a confirming email to confirm we have agreed XYZ. Like you're immediately, because you're so, especially if you're in a
Yeah.
contentious situation. And sometimes you just sit back and maybe you're not offended as easily as you need to be. We don't have to jump right away to be right. And I see this on social media and I see it everywhere that people feel like they've got to say something immediately when sometimes you just don't need to do that. So, in addition to taking mindful moments, which might just be breathing, it might be looking at a candle for a few minutes, just something. I also take some dance breaks in between meetings as well. You talked about getting up and moving. So, I'm going to
Yeah.
end on this. What is, you've got 50 lessons for happy lawyers, and I say for everybody else as well. What's the number one thing, if people did nothing else, what would you want them to do? And I lied. This is not my last question. This is my second to last question. So,
Okay. Well, the one thing that can change everything. That is the lesson that I would if I had to pick one out of this book, that affects every other lesson in this book. The ability to understand and train our own minds can make such a huge difference in our lives. Um, and to just with respect to the book itself, it's written so that you can pick it up, read any lesson that you want. You don't have to read it cover to cover. It's not
mhm.
designed in that way. Each lesson is its own little discrete, 1 or 2 minute read with some suggestions at the end, and resources within that lesson if you want to dig deeper into the things that Chelsea and I are talking about. So I would just say pick it up, pick a lesson, one that resonates with you, and then actually do it. That's the
Exactly.
challenge. You know, knowing something and actually doing that thing are very, very different. That's why we included the living the lesson section at the end. Actually do that thing and just experiment with it. I say this to my clients all the time. Okay. I make suggestions, you make decisions, but I'd suggest that you experiment with this idea. Tweak it, make it your own, do it for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and then reassess. You don't have to commit to doing it for the rest of your life, but see if
Right.
this improves your situation and makes things better.
Last question. How can people
Okay.
work with you? Of course, we're going to go ahead and put all of your contact information in the show notes. But if law firms want to hire you or individuals want to work with you, be a little bit more specific on who you work with, who you serve, and how they can work with you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I am affiliated with a company called Atticus, and so you can reach me at atticusadvantage.com. It's easy to reach me. Let me just put it that way. I've only found one Nora Riva Bergman in the Google machine. So if you put my name in there, you're going to find all kinds of sites that reference me. But you can reach me through Atticus. You can reach me through my own website, which is Real Life Practice. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Insta, all of those places. Um, I work primarily with smaller law firms and shareholders level attorneys at larger law firms. So, and I work sometimes with entire firms, but 20 to 30 lawyers tops. I don't work with really large law firms.
Excellent.
And the reason for that is because smaller firms, solo practitioners have some autonomy over how they actually run their
Yes,
firm. And they can make changes to that firm.
absolutely.
Might be
Without going
slow
through
going
50 committees
sometimes,
and
but
all those other kinds of
all of
things
that.
that larger firms have to
Yes,
go through. Well,
yes.
Nora, this has such a pleasure to have you on here. We've got some great takeaways. We've got the meditation and mindfulness. We've got the thinking about burnout. We've got the importance of recovery. We've got about thinking about lawyers as athletes. There's so many more. So thank you. And I think one day we're going to have a part two. But
Oh,
for
I'd
those
love
who
it.
are listening and paying attention, 50 Lessons for Happy Lawyers, do not just pick this up if you're a lawyer. I read it, and I read it as if I was not a lawyer, and every single lesson is something that can help change your life. And so, with that, Nora, thanks for bringing this book to the world today. Take care.
Thanks so much, Marcia.
Thanks so much for joining us. Stay tuned for the next episode. If you like what you heard, subscribe and share it with others.